The demographic transition theory is widespread description of the changing patterns of mortality, fertility, and growth rates. As societies move from one demographic regime to another, the demographic transition models coined by Frank W. Notestein describes population growth phases: the pre-industrial, transitional, industrial, and post-industrial. Understanding these phases helps address resource depletion. Sustainability concerns the global economic shifts and informing policies and global policies for future generations. Before the demographic transition, according to Thomas Malthus in 1798, in the pre-industrial, there was a slow growth of population due to wages, causing fertility to fall and mortality to rise due to famine, war, disease, and therefore population size in equilibrium with the slowly growing economy. Therefore, the demographic transition societies experience high birth and death rates. With minimal population growth, its population growth declined in 14th and 17th centuries, and more rapid growth in the 15th and the 18th centuries. While exchanges of diseases through exploration and trade may have played some role, global climatic changes was probably the main driving force. Mortality declines. In the Northwest Europe, mortality began decline in 1800s before the Second World War. Mortality rates decreased and rose again after it. The first stage of mortality declines due to reduction in contagious and infectious diseases. In Europe, smallpox vaccine developed in the late 18th century. Health preventive measures of 1900 and increases income to lead improved nutrition and hygiene that decreases its mortality rates.
Between 1890 and 1920, marital fertility rates declined significantly in Europe, with a median drop of about 40% from 1870 to 1930. This decline is linked to complex interactions between fertility and mortality. As child survival improved, parents were incentivized to invest more in fewer children, leading to better outcomes. Economic changes also made childbearing more expensive, particularly with rising costs for education and the opportunity cost of raising children as women increasingly entered workforce. Higher income parents could afford to invest more in each child, but this often led to having fewer children overall. In Europe, contraceptive methods were historically less significant, as coitus interruptus was commonly used, influencing both past and current policies on fertility. According to the United Nations, fertility rates from 1850 to 2050 show varying trends across regions. In industrialized countries, fertility rates dropped significantly after World War II, with a sharp decline in places like Taiwan, South Korea, and China. In these nations, birth rates are lowest among the very young and very old, with most births concentrated in the 20s and early 30s. Fertility rates for women over 35 are much lower in developed countries than in less developed ones. The trend of older childbearing reduces overall fertility rates, but once the average age of childbearing stabilizes, fertility rates may rise again closer to their natural levels. The UN fertility projections suggest that fertility rates in sub-Saharan Africa and other less developed countries will continue to decline slowly, while the decline in less developed countries will slow as it nears replacement levels. While these projections are reasonable, predicting fertility trends has been challenging in past. The theories behind these projections do not suggest a natural limit for fertility, nor they explain how fertility might respond to economic factors in a way that would balance population growth as it did in pre-industrial times.
The population growth rates in more developed countries, MDCs, and less developed countries, LDCs, were similar before 1950, with MDCs slightly higher. After World War II, population growth in less developed countries, LDCs, surged in the mid 1960s, but then declined sharply. By 2050, the share of the global population in MDCs will decrease from 20% to 14% according to UN. Projections global population growth is expected to approach zero by 2100. Over the past 50 years, fertility and mortality rates have become more similar across nations. Although differences still exist, this trend contrasts with per capita GDP, which has growth farther apart between high income and low income countries during the same period. Before 1950, population growth rates in more developed countries (MDCs) were slightly higher than in less developed countries (LDCs). However, the share of the global population in MDCs is expected to decrease from 20% to 14% by 2050. According to UN projections, global population's growth will nearly stop by 2100. The National Research Council 2000 found that there is a 95% likelihood that the global population in 2050 will be between 8.2 and 10.2 billion based on past projections errors. For 2100, the United Nations population projection range is much wider, spanning from 5.2 to 16.2 billion. This uncertainty highlights the challenges in accurately predicting fertility, mortality, and population size for the 21st century. Population growth in more developed countries (MDCs) is expected to remain stable, with declines in Europe and Japan offset by increases in the United States and other regions. The majority of global population growth will occur in less developed countries (LDCs), which will gain 1.8 billion people. The greatest proportional increase will be in less developed countries (LDCs), which will see a 151% growth, adding 1 billion people. The population dynamics of these regions will change over the next 50 years.
The classic example of India case. Display a classic demographic transition using India as an example. The starting points in the figure are actual data from India from 1896 to 2000. The hollow points are based on the UN projections. For India's fertility declined by 50 years. The fertility transition here is low relative to East Asia's, but similar to Latin America's. These trends interact to create population growth rate that rose from less than 0.5% per year in the 1900 to more than 2% per year by 1950. Before starting to decline, these shifts can be seen in the working age population. For example, the child dependency ratio is the population age 0 to 14 divided by the population age 15 to 64 years old. Dependency ratio usually defined as the number of those 65 and older divided by the population age 15 to 64.
Hi, I'm Henry Victorillo, and I'm going to talk about transition in age distribution by current development category. Remember that even in 1950, the least developed countries had higher fertility and higher mortality than the less developed countries, and change since then has been slower for them. The least developed countries moved slowly out of the phase of rising youth dependency and entered the bonus phase around 1980. For these countries, The total dependency ratio is projected to fall sharply from 2000 to 2050. They already have the median age that the less developed countries are projected to achieve by 2050, at which time the median age in the more developed countries will have risen another 8 years to 45.2 years. Lower fertility or longer life expectancy. The total dependency ratio in the more developed countries is projected to rise sharply over the next 50 years as their low fertility increasingly affects labor force size and the baby boom generations move into old age. When population aging is due to the declining fertility, it raises the share of the elderly population without altering the remaining life expectancy of older individuals. The desire to have fewer children may be related to the rise of public sector pensions, which disconnect old age support from individual fertility, and may have played some role in causing low fertility in industrial nations. While lower fertility may go with reduced total parental expenditures on children, it also raises the ratio of elderly to working age people. Other things equal, with no corresponding improvement in health to facilitate a prolongation of working years. By contrast, population aging due to declining mortality is generally associated with increasing health and improving the functional status of the elderly. While such aging puts pressures on pension programs that have rigid retirement ages, that problem is a curable institutional one, not a fundamental societal resource problem, since the ratio of healthy, vigorous years over the life cycle to frail or disabled years that has not necessarily changed.